We've been talking about racism in Australia, and it's a difficult and it's a hard truth to come to terms with. But racism is grounded into our history and our DNA as a country. It began with colonisation. It began with what took place for our Aboriginal people who were hunted, who were murdered, and then died as a result of the diseases that we had introduced. It's also a hard truth to accept that the church and God's people were part of that. Minister Samuel Lee was quoted as, "Aborigines were barbarians to whom had been assigned the lowest place in the scale of intellect." And a minister by the name of Thomas Dove was writing for a scientific journal at the time, and he was writing about Tasmanian Aborigines. And he says, "They live in the lowest state of degradation, lacing all moral views and impressions. Such is the depth of their degradation that they have reached the level of the beasts. Every thought bearing upon the nature of rational beings has now been erased from their breasts." These are very sobering words. And if you're interested, there's a fantastic book being written by John Harris called One Blood that details in a very fair and balanced way the history. And you'll be glad to know that not all Christians embraced those views, and many actively stood against the killings, the way they were covered in the press, and actually set up many missions to address the suffering that had been brought about because of colonisation. But it'd be fair to say that we also live with a heritage of the White Australian policy, which began with an act called the Immigration Restrictions Act in 1901. It's also a little bit sobering as I think about this in my own life, that this White Australia policy was dismantled in my time. It came to an end only in 1973. So you might be thinking, well, really, that's somewhere in the past. Isn't it a bit harsh to zero in on that? Well, there's been some really interesting work done by the Western Sydney University, and they've been running for some years now a project that's been looking into racism. And there was a recent survey conducted called Challenging Racism Project. And what they found was some staggering results that correlated with other research that was taking place across Australia. And this is current research. They found that 85% of people still believed that racism was occurring in Australia. 20% said that they had been the direct recipient of hate speech and racism. 11% said that it had interfered with their inclusion for both employment and social activity. And frighteningly, 6% said that they had not only been vilified verbally, but had expressed that they had been pushed and shoved as a result solely of their race, of their ethnic origin, of their national people group. When you start to think about this, racism makes an absolute mockery of Jesus' words. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 12, Jesus is recorded as saying, "Do to others whatever you would like them to do to you. This is the essence of all that is taught in the law and the prophets." You might also recall that when experts in religious law, Pharisees, came to see whether they could somehow engage Jesus into misspeak, there was a question asked which was, what's the most important commandment of the law of Moses? And you might recall Jesus paused and answered this in a very challenging way. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. A second is equally important. Love your neighbour as yourself. And you'll find that in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 36. But there was another encounter which was very similar. Again, an expert in the religious law came and questioned Jesus about this. And you'll find that in Luke chapter 10, verse 37, where what happens is this dialogue takes place and the religious law expert asks, "Who is my neighbour?" And Jesus gives this expert a very surprising response. Not only does he say it is a Samaritan, but he describes the Samaritan as the Good Samaritan. There was an enormous ethnic divide between Jews and Samaritans. So the hero of Jesus' story was someone from a different ethnic group who was somewhat despised. So if you look at this, you see that there is absolutely no grounds. And if we continue with racism, we actually mock Jesus' words. So God calls us then to respond. And he calls us to meet racism head on. And he asks us to respond with justice, mercy and love. You might recall in Micah 6:8 the words that we have come to know, and I'll come to that in a moment. But I want you to think of Micah of Moresheth. He was faced with a very difficult task. He was asked to speak a very confronting message to the people of Samaria and Israel. And it was at the time of three kings, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah. And his message was that God is coming to trample on the earth. And what happens is Micah calls out the injustices, the way those are being oppressed by the wealthy, by unfair leadership, by looming guilt, by practices that were out of step with God's way of treating people. And in chapter 5, verse 4, Micah reminds us that this is not the end. He says he's going to send someone to lead his flock with strength. And so there's a glimmer of hope. But then he turns to the people in the midst of what is but a very confronting message, and he says, "Know, O people, the Lord has told you what is good." He leaves them in no doubt what is good. And this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So the living God calls us to respond with righteousness and justice. If we look in the Old Testament, the word righteous is really about living in right relationship. It's about treating people with dignity. If we think about the idea of justice in the Old Testament, we come across a really interesting Hebrew word, mishpat. And mishpat is used multiple times throughout the Old Testament. And it talks about justice in two ways: retributive and restorative. Retributive we get. That's where we say the punishment meets the crime. That the majority of the times when God is talking about justice, he's talking about it in terms of it being restorative. It's about recognising that there are people who are vulnerable. There are people who have been oppressed. There are those who are the recipients of injustice. And when God talks about this righteousness, he talks about reaching out, extending a helping hand, lifting up. It's about restoring people to the right relationship of righteousness, living in right relationship with human dignity. The Bible Project has a great clip on justice, and I borrowed a line from it because I thought it was very helpful. It said, "Justice and righteousness are about a radical, selfless way of life." And brothers and sisters, that's the life that we're called to live. That is how we're called to respond to racism. You might also like later on to have a look at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 to 21, because you see there the ideas of righteousness and justice being illustrated by God. He powerfully expresses that in the way those who are most vulnerable should be treated, and in particular the foreigner, the one who sits outside the Jewish nation, makes it very clear of how they are to respond with love and care and mercy. So if we think about all of this and we sort of start to pull it together, we also need to recognise that we are people with privilege. Part of that privilege has arisen out of injustice. And I know that that is a very challenging thought and somewhat unnerving. But when people lose out, other people gain. It's a little bit like how we illustrated early on with the make-believe game of Monopoly. We need to recognise that we have privilege, partly because of the family situation we've been brought into, partly the country we've been born into, partly because of colonisation, partly because this earth here in Australia, the land, was declared as terra nullius. We need to realise, partly because of the White Australian policy, partly because of the way refugees are treated, and partly because of discrimination to those who are different, we have benefited. So we need to look at how do we use our privilege. And when we do that, we need to think about that not from the point of view of entitlement, nor to be patronising or to be paternalistic. But we need to recognise, brothers and sisters, we have privilege. And God calls us to live out that justice and righteousness and mercy and love with care. And that care is proactively using our privilege.
I'm often asked, why don't we just forget about it all? Why don't we just get over this history? Why don't we just forget the past? Why do we still cling to this thing of race? Why do we still talk about racism? Look at your life. Look at me, they say. You've had a good career. You're successful. Why do you have to continually talk about race and racism? Because it still exists. Because it is there, because it can touch my life at any time. Because I know there are people in my life whose lives are framed by the colour of their skin, for whom history is a dead weight. There is nothing I would want more than to be free of the chains of history. There is nothing I would want more than for my children to live in a world where they can be all that they want to be. But we're not there yet. But it is us. It is black people in America. It is black people in Australia who have walked the longest road and carried the greatest burden for all of you. That in spite of everything that's happened to us, our people have offered love. It is our people who have longed for that moment when we can all be free, when we don't have to be framed by race and history. And our people who ask all of you to walk the last part of that journey with us.